So we're gonna change gears just a little bit. Our next session is gonna explore what it takes to provide internet to more people around the world. And I'm very pleased to introduce two guests who can provide both a technical perspective on that and also a public policy perspective. Dave Schaefer is the founder and CEO of Cogent Communications, a Tier 1 internet service provider ranked as one of the top 5 networks in the world. Cogent provides internet access and data transport services to companies, carriers, and others who rely on internet access. The company built its own IP data network independent of the traditional voice-based networks of the large telecom companies, which allowed Cogent to reduce the high cost of bandwidth down to a level never before offered in the marketplace. They founded Cogent in 1999, and over the last 17 years has built it into one of the world's largest ISPs. Anya Emanuel is co-founder and principal in Rice Hadley Gates, along with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. The company is a strategic consulting firm that helps U.S. companies navigate international markets. She's also the author of This Brave New World: India, China, and the United States, which explores how each country's history and politics influences their conduct today. From 2005 to 2007, she was responsible for South Asia policy at the U.S. State Department. Anya is also a lecturer at Stanford and sits on Governor Jerry Brown's Advisory Council on International Trade and Investment. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So Anya, I'll start with you. Frame the issue for us. What does it mean when we talk about providing internet to more people around the world?
Thank you, first of all, for having me here. This is a great event. I had the privilege of working with Jen in government and was very happy to hear her presentation too. Let me just frame the issue from a policy perspective. So overall, getting access to the internet for the world's people has been a stunning success. 3.6 billion people out of the 7.5 or so that we are, 3.6 billion people are on the internet. And it's growing by hundreds of millions a year. The problem these days, and I'm sure Dave will talk about it more, it's less accessibility, because there are 1.3 billion Android phones on Earth. It's more the expensive cost of data, which Cogent and other companies are trying to bring down. So all of that is a hugely positive trend. But there's a counter trend that you need to look at, which is that of those 3.6 billion people, over a third live in countries where the internet is heavily censored. So China, Russia, the Middle East, places that where the internet that we see here, global, interoperable, open to everyone, freedom of expression, it just doesn't exist in that way there. And let me give you just some examples. China and Russia had a conference this summer where the discussion was all about how the internet shouldn't really be international. It should have country boundaries, just like real physical countries have boundaries, which of course is completely anathema to what was created here in the 80s and 90s. And the internet would look nothing like what we would want it to look like today. Around the world, and I don't want to pick just on Russia and China, but in lots of other countries, you have data localization laws. Many of you probably work with this specifically, where they're saying any data about our citizens needs to be stored here in country, and that means, by the way, we can monitor absolutely everything they're doing. China alone employs 2 million people just to censor its internet behind the Great Firewall. I've never seen any of these, but you imagine people in a warehouse sort of, deleting people's tweets. And, it has a real impact on global commerce as well. In China, 8 of the world's 25 most popular websites are blocked, including Facebook and Google and Twitter and many of the ones here. The U.S. administration has said that's a restraint of trade because, of course, we don't block Chinese internet sites here. So overall, this is a positive story, but there are countervailing trends that we can all help manage from here. And if not managed well, I think in 20 years, you'll see an internet that's quite different from the one that we all grew up with and that you all spend your times working with.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about the internet and we use that one word, and it means very different things in different parts of the world, I think both from a kind of government-driven policy standpoint, but also technically. Right, Dave? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? You hear a lot about projects that Facebook and Google are pursuing about bringing more people online. That's actually a different type of product that we're used to.
There's a great challenge to bring the remaining population of the world into the 21st century and bring them online. You know, the internet has succeeded for several reasons. First of all, it was a network that could sit on top of any other network, so it was not built initially as a purpose-built network. Secondly, it's a network that had no particular application in mind when it was conceived and as it is developed. It's that level of flexibility that has created the value of the internet and why people value it so greatly. But as we look at the world, of those 3.6 billion people connected, that means there's 3.7 billion people that are not connected. And it's going to be very hard to get the remaining population connected. If we disaggregate those numbers, about 900 million people have broadband connections the way we know it, a fixed wireline connection that really allows us to use the internet the way we are accustomed to using it. The remaining roughly 2.7, 2.8 billion people that connect to the internet connect actually through mobile devices, which are much more expensive to operate on a per bit basis. Many of the countries have very low teledensity. They have poor regulations even for their telecom infrastructure. And in many of those countries, the telecom infrastructure is a cash cow for the government. Usually the government owns them. The U.S. is a bit unique in that our telecommunications industry was private. Although it was heavily regulated, it was private. Whereas in many countries, it's the PTT, the Postal Telephone and Telegraph Network, that is the underlying infrastructure for the internet. And the internet is very threatening to those companies in that it delaminates the application from the network. It means that much of that voice revenue that they're so dependent on is going to go away. So oftentimes you have internal conflicts within the government. Some parts of the government want the internet, others don't. So as we look at new projects that are looking to bring internet to these remote areas, they're looking to do so, one, by improving teledensity, two, creating new business models are not dependent on a subscription-based model and maybe ad-based or application-based. Now that brings a whole nother set of concerns, which is, does that service provider really allow their competitors to use the internet as well? So there's a balancing act in any of these business models, and we have a lot of work to do. The easy work is behind us. It's going to be very hard to get the remainder of the world on the internet.
And from a user's perspective, what are the implications behind the different sort of types of networks, putting aside sort of the policy and some of the censorship issues that Anya referenced before? How does the impact to the user vary because of these things?
So, you know, everyone in this room and all of us use the internet on a regular basis, but very few people could actually define exactly what the internet is. And it's a very definable thing. It's a network that has somewhere around 1,400 petabytes a day of information passing across it. The average bit travels 2,700 miles. It goes through 2.4 networks from origin to destination, and it'll traverse 8.5 routers between origin and destination. And the internet works because 50,000 networks interconnect with one another and do not block traffic between those networks. So for a wireless user, those bits are very valuable because you can use them anywhere at any time, and they're extremely flexible, but they're very expensive. You know, wireless delivery of information is orders of magnitude more expensive than fixed line. So countries that had existing fixed line infrastructure, whether it be cable or telephone, that allowed for internet service providers like ourselves to leverage that infrastructure, have much better user experience, have much richer content. You know, a small screen helps in that you have less information on that small screen, but you know, the main application today that people are driving bandwidth growth on is video. And you know, the video experience on a 4-inch screen is very different than a 60-inch screen. And you do need to have fixed line connectivity to give a good user experience on that large screen. So there needs to eventually be a business model where service providers can deploy capital, get an adequate return, and build that infrastructure, and at the same time not be married to any application. The internet has flourished because it's application agnostic.
Mm-hmm. So in one topic that's quite timely today and over the next couple of weeks is the regulation of ICANN, for example, which regulates the root domain system. You know, what are your, I guess for both of you, what are your views on that, and then what are the two sides of the argument behind, you know, between regulation and sort of the self-regulatory point that you made before?
Great question. Thank you. Let me start with why should we care? We're all sitting comfortably in this room here in Silicon Valley. Most of us work in tech, and I think we have this assumption that if our little companies grow big, of course we're going to be doing business in other countries. Of course there's going to be one global interoperable internet. Of course our friends in China and Russia and the Middle East and Latin America are going to be able to talk to us on WeChat or WhatsApp or whatever it is. That's not 100% a given. That was actually done because people who were early, and I think you're hearing from Tim Berners-Lee, you know, folks who started this whole process were very thoughtful about how the internet would be governed or not governed. And the answer is, it is only very loosely governed. So ICANN is a nonprofit organization based here in California, and it basically manages the domain name system, which means if there's .com, .org, .paris, .netherlands, they create those new domain names. They also, I think, have loose management responsibility over the root servers, actually the backbone of the internet. I know Dave and Cogent manages one of those, but there are 13, and they're all around the world. So why do we care about this? In the 1990s, when the internet was first getting big, the US government said, let's have a $0 contract with ICANN to just have minimal oversight and make sure this works. Across 3 presidential administrations, there's never been a problem. The Commerce Department basically rubber stamps when they say, okay, fine, now we're going to have .paris as a domain name. And that contract is about to expire now, like on September 30th. And this really should be a political non-issue. But in the crazy political environment we're in, a few folks, including Senator Cruz, now that he's no longer running for president, have decided that this is a big political issue. And actually, if we give away the internet, if the US government no longer has control, he argues, then folks like China and Russia will take control. That is exactly backwards. Because when I spend a lot of time in China and India and Russia and these places, what I hear from folks there is, well, you Americans are controlling the internet, so we need to have our own national internets. And if you don't let go, as the US government, of this, we're going to start moving in that direction. So this is something that you all can actually do. This is the week. I don't usually tell people to call your congressman, but call, I'm telling you right now, call Senator Thune, who's the head of the Judiciary Committee, who's kind of on the fence about this. Call Senator McConnell. This is the week that the decision is going to get made, and it's not at all clear that it's going to go the right way. So there's my little spiel on that. I think the one more thing, and then I'd love to hear your views on ICANN too. Another thing we can all do to continue this internet that has worked really well for all of us is to keep supporting US companies willingness to expand abroad. I think there's often an instinct to just give up and say, well, LinkedIn, they're kind of in China, Facebook's never going to get in. And there's a lot of criticism on the US side of companies that try to expand internationally. I think that's wrong. I think even if you have to go and live by the national restrictions in a country that you're trying to do business, the idea of interacting more with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Russians, with the others is always a good thing. And so we should support our companies' willingness to do business in all of those places.
Well, I couldn't agree more that the openness of the internet is a success. Bob Metcalfe coined, I guess, an axiom, the inventor of Ethernet, that said the value of the network is worth the square of the number of unique users to the network. And I think that really understates the value of the internet, because it's not only the square of the number of users, but also what percentage of their time they spend on the internet and what is the value that they get out of the internet. And I think by that algorithm, you would see the internet is increasingly important to society. The Congressional Budget Office did a study probably about 5 years ago now and concluded that basically 1% of real GDP growth per year globally was attributable to productivity improvements caused by the internet. And it's this very decentralized idea where anybody can have a good idea, anybody can publish that idea to a global audience, and it's now available to everyone in the world. And the reality is most of those ideas fail, but a few become wildly successful and change the way we live. And no one picks the winners and losers. The end users are empowered to do that. And it's this decentralization that has been the cornerstone of the internet. So going back in history and looking at the control of the internet, actually in 1991, the Department of Commerce was tasked with privatizing the ARPA and DARPA nets and called a conference in D.C. that was actually hosted on Wisconsin Avenue at the National Academy of Sciences. 66 companies came to that event, and actually only 8 raised their hand to take over this thing called the internet, to privatize it. And the requirement almost seems ludicrous today that in order to be one of those initial backbones, you had to agree to connect a T1 between 9 physical sites geographically dispersed in North America. And if you did that, you were a global, quote-unquote, Tier 1 internet provider. And at the application layer, the internet was free to do whatever it wanted. At the control plane layer, there was this idea of root servers. And there are 13 root servers. 11 of those are run by not-for-profit entities, research entities for the most part, and 2 of them are run by for-profit entities. Ourselves and VeriSign run 2 of the root servers. And, when you type a web address in, what you're doing is expecting that set of characters to be translated into a hexadecimal numeric code that is basically the IP address of that website. Now, IPv4 is somewhat limited. It's 2 to the 64th addresses. There's about 4.2 billion addresses. And we're facing an exhaustion there, so we've been migrating to IPv6, which increases the address space to a virtually unlimited number at 2 to 128. But it's this root server system that's very distributed, very self-healing, and really self-regulating. In fact, the underlying software that runs these root servers is free shareware. Guy wrote it, Paul Vixie, still around, still does updates on it for free. There's a root server working group that meets once a year. There's no government sponsorship. People go to a different location in the world and talk about technical issues, how to secure the root servers, how to make them work more efficiently. And the reality is the actual resolution of an address to your domain name is being done by your service provider in a very distributed DNS environment. So this whole ICANN, who controls what, discussion is truly much ado about nothing. It's a political issue by people who have no comprehension of the mechanics of how the internet actually works.
I think this
And it proves that these days everything has become a political football.
wasn't meant to be a plug, but I guess it turned out to be that. More broadly, what's the role for government then?
Oh, I think the government has a very strong role to play in preserving the internet. You know, I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I actually dislike regulation viscerally. And it was funny, when I had to go meet with the FCC chairman a couple of years ago and ask for regulatory support, he laughed and he says, "Do you want to wash your mouth out with soap now after you've asked for this?" And it really revolves around this issue of net neutrality. And in the, I guess, benign form, it's certain providers refusing to allow their customers to get access to all content equally on an unfettered basis. Maybe on a more extreme case, it's a country putting up a firewall like the Golden Wall in China and having 2 million people scrub through traffic going in and out and filtering things. But the internet works because it is a level playing field. And the government needs to make sure that it's a traffic cop in that relationship. And the reason is local distribution of any utility, whether it be roads or water or gas or electricity, telephone services, cable services, or the internet, are all natural monopolies. And monopolists will abuse their power if they are not regulated. So there's a social contract that's made that says you get some monopoly rights, but in exchange you have to agree to a set of consumer protections. We in the West adopted those rules. You know, we were very fortunate that we had an FCC chairman who stood up to some political opponents and passed some pretty tough net neutrality rules. They don't favor anybody, but they don't prohibit anybody from selling their application or content to anyone in the world. We saw the European Union struggle a little bit, get to some regulations that were more or less in line with what we have in the U.S., but not quite as strong. And then when you get outside of those two geographic theaters, you're seeing people around the world really struggle with this. They want content to reside in their own countries. Servers have to sit in their own countries. This has nothing to do with web performance. This has to do with political control. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's a very dangerous place if we allow that to continue. Mm-hmm.
You're not getting much disagreement here. I agree completely with what Dave said. And I think the internet is so unique. It's the only time that there has been in the world true government by the people for the people. So the fact that this works with distributed root servers, the fact that there isn't the United Nations as one central authority controlling it, that there aren't national governments who are controlling it, is a huge victory, and it's something that we shouldn't take lightly. And I think the US government has been really thoughtful about this, to step in when there is a need to, like on net neutrality and others, but then to keep out and let the community, like all of you guys, basically govern themselves.
So I think we have about 5 minutes left, so we have time for a few questions from the audience, if any of you guys want to ask Dave or Anya a question.
What do we say to the congressman?
That's a good question.
It's a good point. I guess I would say, look, I can send you more detailed talking points, but the bottom line is China and India are not going to take over the internet if you allow this contract with the Commerce Department to expire. This is a non-issue, and you should just let it expire. Yeah.
So you were mentioning about censorship in countries like China and Russia before. And there used to be, from a technological perspective, a lot of technologists who were interested in anti-censorship. there was this idea that maybe technology was going to solve this problem, and that hope was alive for a while, but it sort of has become more clear over the past, decade or so that even if we can make it so that people in countries like that can access some information, that actually doesn't have a huge impact. Like the censorship model that China and Russia are using now is, well, at least if we censor most of the things and we, make it like, have government-sponsored bloggers and things like that, it'll look to most of the people the way that we want it to look, and that seems to be good enough. So it seems that technology actually isn't going to be able to solve that problem. Is there an alternative political approach that we can take to address things like censorship that, as you were mentioning, have to do with, if we want full internet penetration everywhere around the world for everyone, we really have to solve that problem?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of us used to have a very purist view of this. Everyone would be on the internet and suddenly there'd be free speech for all. That hasn't quite worked out because as we get ever more sophisticated algorithms to serve up ads, turns out the censorship side also gets more and more sophisticated and can root out things that they don't want people to say. I think there's no silver bullet, but it's a keep on trying and gently pushing. So there's no reason for US internet companies to give up trying to go to China. I'm picking on China a lot today. There's a lot of other countries too, to China and Saudi Arabia, and in some cases Brazil. Brazil was shutting down bits of the internet just during the Olympics. We should keep going. We should gently, because if you push too hard, you're going to get kicked out. This is what happened with Google. They had a very ethical, very thoughtful stance, but it resulted in they got kicked out of China, right? Or they left China. But I think by gradually getting people to communicate more, gradually prodding both on the government side and on the technology side, ultimately, I'm an optimist. I think we're going to move that trend back in the right direction.
Hi, my name's Joe Jason. I'm with a firm called DNA Partners. We're a seed investment firm here in Silicon Valley and China. My question is in regard to the FCC's new law that passed that the internet is now a utility, and the commissioner is calling it a commodity, and I'm fine with that. I'm neutral on this question. So do you think there may be new taxation associated with service providers' connectivity and service providers' digital media?
So I think the chairman had to go ahead and classify the provision of internet services as a Title II service. That's a section of the FCC code that allows them to then implement rules. Now, they took a very light approach and really, in a 400-page document, spent about 200 pages explaining how all the other previous commissions had failed in front of courts, and they wanted to address issues that various courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and particularly an opinion written by Anton Scalia, prohibiting the FCC from having any opinion on the internet. So they put all of that in place. They classified it as a Title II service, and they basically put 4 guiding principles. There's not one single regulation in place today for the internet. Those principles are pretty uncontroversial, I think. There's no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and all bits have to get through, and that a service provider has an obligation to make all addresses on the internet available to their end users. Those are pretty simple statements. What they did is they kept a big stick in their back pocket and said, if you don't do that, we can be much more prescriptive in our regulations and step in all the way to the point of rate regulating or removing your ability to actually sell services if you abuse it. And there's a clear pattern of abuse from Comcast and AT&T and Verizon. So it's not like the service providers were innocent. You have to remember the internet is a cable or phone company's worst nightmare. Brian Roberts probably goes to sleep every night and prays that when he wakes up in the morning, this thing called the internet is gone, because then there's no Netflix to compete with him. Now, in terms of taxation, Congress has been very clear. There's an Internet Tax Freedom Act. It does have an expiration, but it has been extended now, I think, 16 consecutive times. And it specifically says the Internet is exempt from any taxation. That does, though, present a problem. We have a second agenda in America, which is broadband connectivity to those that don't have the resources to have it on their own. And for 100 years, we had a cross-subsidy situation in telecommunications where businesses paid more than residential, people in cities subsidized rural services, and finally, consumers subsidized education and government. Those were done through the Universal Service Fund. It's actually a tax you see on your phone bill every month. It's actually pretty confiscatory. It's 17.4%. That's a big tax. Going forward, those funds have been diverted from traditional telephone services to broadband services. And there are several programs. There's an E-rate program, a BTAP program, that are designed to build broadband out to schools and to rural communities. However, it's being subsidized by a shrinking revenue base, which are the legacy services. So there is a fundamental problem that the new services need to be developed. They need to be subsidized in rural areas where they're not cost effective, unless we want to be a society that says only city dwellers get good internet service and people in the suburbs and in farms don't. And I don't think that's our social plan. So with that, there has to be a subsidization mechanism, and ultimately it is going to have to come out of the like users in the markets. Now today, that's actually prohibited by Congress, and it's just another example of this political ineffectiveness we have where the two sides can't somehow come to a common sense answer.
So I too am going to try to keep us on time. We are out of time, but I want to thank Dave and Anya for being here and for a great discussion. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot.